For 10,000 years, time was a ghost. It had no face, no numbers, and certainly no master. If you were a merchant in ancient Rome or a farmer in the 1600s, your life was governed by two things: the rising sun and the turning of the seasons. There was no 9 to 5. There were no deadlines. There was only the strength of your arms, the loyalty of your horse, and the unpredictable whims of the wind. Humanity was trapped in a beautiful but finite loop. Everything we touched was handmade. Everything we ate was local. Everything we built had a limit, a biological ceiling that we simply could not break. But in the year 1760 inches, a damp, mineral-rich corner of an island called Great Britain, that ancient rhythm didn't just change, it shattered. Imagine a world where a single man suddenly has the strength of 100 horses. Imagine a city that never sleeps because it no longer needs the sun. This wasn't just a change in how we worked. It was a fundamental rewiring of what it meant to be human. We call it the Industrial Revolution, but for those who lived through its birth, it felt like the arrival of a god or perhaps a monster. We are told this is a story of progress, of steam engines, flying shuttles, and the birth of modern wealth. But history is written by the winners, and the winners were sitting in gold-leafed London offices. If you look closer into the bruised skies of Manchester or the flooded tunnels of Cornwall, you'll find a much darker truth. This was a revolution built on the backs of children who would never see the sun. It was fueled by a black rock dragged from the bowels of the earth. It was a moment when humanity unlocked the stored energy of millions of years, and in our rush to build a new civilization, we almost burned the old one to the ground. How did a small island nation, once a peripheral player on the edge of Europe, suddenly become the laboratory for the future? Why did the world's most powerful empires, the Qing in China, the Mughals in India, stand still while Britain moved at proper? The speed of steam. And most importantly, what was the true cost of the progress that created the device you are holding in your hand right now? Today, we go back to the beginning. Back to the smoke, the gears, and the greed. This is the story of how we broke the world to build a new one. This is the Industrial Revolution. But before the first engine ever hissed with steam, there was a secret, a geographic windfall, and a legal cheat code that Britain possessed, which no one else did. Without it, the modern world would never have happened. And it all started with a mountain of black stone. In 1750, if you were a betting man, you wouldn't have put your money on Britain. China was the wealthiest empire on earth, a sophisticated giant of culture and trade. India was the world's textile factory, producing fabrics so fine they felt like woven air. Compared to them, Britain was a rainy peripheral outpost. But Britain had a cheat code. Actually, it had 5. Historians call this the Great Divergence. It was the moment the West pulled away from the East, and it was built on 5 immovable pillars that created a perfect storm for revolution. The first pillar: the agricultural revolution. Before you can have a factory, you need people. And before you can have people in cities, you need to feed them with fewer hands. While the rest of the world was still backbreakingly farming by hand, the British were experimenting. They invented mechanical seed drills and iron plows. They turned farming into a science. The result: a food surplus and a massive population of displaced peasants. These people didn't have farms anymore, they had hunger. And that hunger drove them straight into the arms of the new industrial cities, providing the most essential fuel of all: cheap, desperate labor. The second pillar: a legal fortress. In many empires, if the king wanted your money, he took it. But Britain was different. Following the Glorious Revolution, they had established the most stable legal system in the world. Property rights were sacred. If you invented something or started a company, the government couldn't just seize it. This created a culture of calculated risk. For the first time, entrepreneurs felt safe enough to invest their life savings into crazy ideas like steam-powered pumps. The third pillar: geographic windfall. Look at a map of Britain. It is an island carved with deep, navigable rivers and endless coastlines. In a world where moving goods by land was 10 times more expensive than by water, Britain was a natural highway. You were never more than 70 miles from the sea. This meant that raw materials could flow in, and finished goods could flow out with a frictionless ease that continental giants like Russia or France could only dream of. The fourth pillar: the culture of the why. While other nations focused on abstract philosophy, The British were obsessed with practical science. The scientific revolution of the 17th century had left behind a legacy of tinkerers, backyard inventors, and coffeehouse intellectuals. They weren't just asking, why does the universe exist? They were asking, how can I make this gear turn faster? It was a marriage of the laboratory and the workshop. The fifth pillar, the lottery of coal. But all the laws and inventors in the world mean nothing without energy. And here is where Britain won the cosmic lottery. The island was literally sitting on a mountain of coal, high-quality, easily accessible coal located right next to the sea. In London, wood was becoming a luxury. It was expensive to keep warm. But coal was cheap. In fact, Britain had a unique economic anomaly. It had the highest wages in the world and the cheapest energy in the world. Think about that. If it's expensive to hire a man, but it's dirt cheap to buy a ton of coal, what do? You build a machine. You replace expensive human muscle with cheap coal-fired steam. This was the tipping point. This was the moment the monster began to stir. But Britain's newfound power faced an immediate and deadly threat. It wasn't a war or an invading army. It was white gold, a fabric from the East that was so popular it threatened to bankrupt the British Empire before the revolution even began. To survive, Britain had to do something radical. They had to automate the impossible. But Britain's newfound power faced an immediate and deadly threat. It wasn't a war or an invading army. It was white gold. By the mid-1700s, British merchants were panicking. Across the ocean, the Mughal Empire in India was producing cotton fabrics so light, so durable, and so beautiful that the British public was obsessed. Indian cotton was the high-tech luxury of the 18th century. British wool and linen producers, the old guard of the economy, were being decimated. They were so desperate that the British government actually passed the Calico Act's laws that literally banned the import of printed cotton from India. It was one of the earliest and most aggressive acts of protectionism in history. But you can't stop progress with a piece of paper. The ban didn't kill the demand. It created a massive vacuum. British entrepreneurs realized that if they couldn't buy cotton from India, they would have to make it themselves. There was just one problem. Indian labor was 5 times cheaper, and their hand-weaving skills were centuries ahead. To compete, the British didn't need faster hands. They needed something that didn't have hands at all. They needed a miracle of engineering. The first domino fell in 1733 with John Kay and his flying shuttle. Before Kay, weaving was a slow, two-handed process. The flying shuttle allowed a single weaver to double their output with a simple flick of a wrist. It was a sensation, but it created a massive innovation bottleneck. Suddenly, the weavers were moving so fast that the spinners, the people making the yarn, couldn't keep up. It took 8 spinners just to supply 1 weaver. The whole industry was lopsided, waiting for the next spark of genius. That spark came from James Hargreaves, a simple carpenter and weaver. Legend says he saw his daughter Jenny knock over a spinning wheel, and as it kept spinning on its side, he had a eureka moment. He built the spinning jenny. For the first time in human history, one person could spin 8 threads at once. Then 16, then 80. But even the spinning jenny had a flaw. The thread it produced was weak. It was cottage industry tech, good for a home but not for an empire. Enter Richard Arkwright. If the Industrial Revolution had a Steve Jobs, it was him. Arkwright wasn't just an inventor. He was a ruthless businessman with a legal iron fist. He took the existing ideas and developed the water frame. This machine was too big for a cottage and too heavy for a human to turn. It required the raw, crushing power of a rushing river. In 1771, Arkwright built Cromford Mill. It wasn't just a building, it was the world's first true factory. He gathered hundreds of workers under one roof, synchronized them to the rhythm of the water wheel, and guarded his patents like nuclear secrets. Production was no longer a family affair, it was an industrial process. The results were staggering. In 1750, Britain imported 2.5 million pounds of raw cotton. Within a century, that number would explode to over 500 million pounds. The Indian textile industry, once the pride of the world, was systematically crushed, not by soldiers but by the relentless humming gears of British mills. But as Arkwright's water wheels turned, the revolution hit another wall. Rivers are fickle. They freeze in the winter and dry up in the summer. If humanity wanted to truly conquer the world, they needed a power source that didn't depend on the weather. They needed to reach deep into the earth and awaken a sleeping giant, steam. Before we move into the era of smoke and iron, I have a question for you. If you had the chance to go back to the year 1750 with all your current knowledge, which empire would you choose to live in? Would you pick the sophisticated wealth of Qing China, the artistic heights of Mughal India, or would you take a gamble on the rainy, chaotic uprising of Great Britain? Let me know in the comments. I'll be hearting the most strategic answers. While the textile mills were spinning the world's clothing, a much more violent revolution was happening deep beneath the soil. Britain's hunger for iron and heat had created a crisis. To get to the coal, miners had to go deeper than ever before, and the deeper they went, the more they encountered an invisible, deadly enemy: water. The mines were flooding. Traditional pumps powered by horses walking in endless circles were too weak. It was a stalemate between human ambition and the laws of physics. That was until a self-taught ironmonger named Thomas Newcomen built the first atmospheric engine in 1712. It was a monster of a machine, a massive iron-beamed beast that sat at the mouth of mine shafts, hissing and groaning as it sucked thousands of gallons of water from the earth. By modern standards, it was laughably inefficient. It wasted 99% of its energy. But in a coal mine, fuel was practically free. Newcomen's engine did what no horse could. It allowed humanity to conquer the underworld. But the real godfather of steam wouldn't arrive for another 50 years. Enter James Watt. In 1764, Watt was a simple instrument maker at the University of Glasgow when he was asked to repair a model of a Newcomen engine. He didn't just fix it. He became obsessed with its flaws. He realized that the engine was cooling its main cylinder during every single stroke, a colossal waste of steam and heat. Watt's solution was a separate condenser. It was a simple idea on paper, but a nightmare to build. Watt spent years in poverty on the verge of mental collapse trying to make his perfect engine a reality. He had the genius, but he lacked the one thing every revolution needs: capital. This is where the story takes a Silicon Valley turn. Watt met Matthew Boulton, a wealthy manufacturer from Birmingham. Boulton wasn't a scientist. He was a titan of industry. He saw Watt's invention and didn't just see a pump, he saw a future where every factory on Earth was powered by Watt's brain. Boulton told Watt, "I sell here, sir, what all the world desires: to have power." Together, they formed the most important partnership in industrial history. Boulton provided the funding and the aggressive marketing, while Watt provided the relentless innovation. By the 1780s, they had achieved the impossible. They converted the up and down motion of the steam engine into rotative motion. This changed everything. Suddenly, a factory didn't need to be built next to a fast-moving river. You could build a mill in the middle of a city, in the middle of a field, or at the edge of a harbor. You could bring the power to the people rather than the people to the power. Steam was applied to everything. It blew the bellows of massive blast furnaces, creating iron at a scale never seen since the dawn of time. It drove the looms that weaved the world's clothes. It hammered metal with the force of 100 titans. For the first time in history, mankind was no longer a slave to geography or the weather. We had unlocked ancient sunlight, the energy stored in coal from forests that died 300 million years ago. We were no longer using the energy of the present. We were burning the energy of the past to build the future. By the early 1800s, the steam beast was no longer just pumping water. It was the heartbeat of a new civilization. The quiet green valleys of England were being replaced by black countries, landscapes of permanent smoke and fire, where the sun was obscured by the very breath of progress. Humanity had finally broken the biological ceiling. We were moving faster, producing more, and growing wealthier than any generation in history. But as the gears turned faster and the smoke grew thicker, a new question began to haunt the streets of Britain. At what cost? Because while the steam engine was liberating humanity from labor, it was creating a new kind of prison for the prime, people who had to feed the beast. Chúng ta sẽ bước vào chương tối tăm nhất của kịch bản. Đây là phần kịch bản dùng để đánh vào cảm xúc, tạo ra sự đồng cảm và kinh ngạc về cái giá của sự thịnh vượng. Tôi sẽ sử dụng các phép so sánh cực đoan để giữ chân người xem trong giai đoạn trũng này của video. While the titans of industry were counting their gold in the sunlit offices of London, a new kind of hell was being forged in the north. For 10,000 years, humanity lived in the green. We followed the cycle of the soil, but in just a few decades, the Industrial Revolution performed a mass migration that would change the face of the planet forever. In 1800, only 3% of the human population lived in cities. By the end of the century, that number was approaching 50%. This wasn't a planned expansion. It was a chaotic, violent explosion. The epicenter of this blast was Manchester. Once a modest market town, it earned a new chilling nickname, Cottonopolis. Within a single lifetime, its population went from 1,000,000 to nearly 500,000. It became the template for the modern world, and it was a nightmare. Imagine a city where the sky is permanently bruised, a deep, sickly purple from the constant exhale of coal smoke. Imagine a place where the air is so thick with soot that you can taste the progress in your lungs. Friedrich Engels, a man who witnessed this firsthand, described the back streets of Manchester as a stony desert. He saw rivers that had turned green and black from chemical waste, smelling so foul that the stench became a physical weight on the chest of every citizen. But the real shadow wasn't in the sky, it was in the streets. Because people flooded into the cities faster than houses could be built, families were squeezed into cellar dwellings, damp underground rooms with dirt floors and no windows. There were no toilets, no running water, no trash collection. Raw sewage flowed in the streets where children played. In these conditions, invisible killers like cholera and typhoid became the true masters of the city. In the mid-19th century, the average life expectancy for a laborer in an industrial city plummeted to just 17 years. Think about that. In the wealthiest nation the world had ever seen, a working man had a shorter life than a peasant in the Middle Ages. Inside the factories, the human machine was being broken. In the rural world, you worked when there was light. In the industrial world, you worked when the clock told you to. The factory system demanded that humans adapt to the relentless, unchanging pace of the machines. Shifts lasted 1, 2, 1, 4, sometimes 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. And the most tragic fuel of this system, the children. Small, nimble and cheap children, as young as 6 or 7, were the scavengers of the textile mills. They were forced to crawl under moving machinery, to pick up loose cotton, their tiny fingers inches away from being crushed by iron gears. In the coal mines, trappers' children who sat in total darkness for 12 hours a day opened and closed ventilation doors for the coal carts. They were paid 10% of an adult's wage and treated as disposable parts of the engine. This was the brutal irony of the 19th century. The steam engine had promised to liberate humanity from back-breaking labor, yet it had created a new form of slavery. The world was getting richer, the British Empire was painting the map red, and the middle class was buying fine china and tea. But underneath it all, the gears were being greased with the sweat and blood of a generation that would never see the fruits of their labor. The progress was real. But for the millions living in the slums of Manchester, Sheffield and Birmingham, it didn't feel like a revolution. It felt like an ending. But as the tension between the wealthy and the workers reached a boiling point, the revolution took another turn. It wasn't just machines that were evolving, it was the world itself. A new invention was about to shrink the planet, moving ideas and people faster than the speed of sound. The age of the iron horse was coming, and it would change the meaning of distance forever. By the early 1800s, Britain was no longer just a nation, it was the world's workshop. But its massive output faced a final, frustrating barrier, the mud. For centuries, moving heavy goods like coal and iron across land was a slow, agonizing process. If the roads weren't washed away by rain, they were clogged with slow-moving horse carts. Canals had provided a temporary fix, lowering coal prices by half overnight, but water couldn't go everywhere. The revolution needed a new set of veins. It needed the railway. The birth of the iron horse was a marriage of 3 industrial titans: cheap puddled iron for the rails, the rolling mill to shape them, and the high-pressure steam engine to drive them. When George Stephenson's rocket roared between Liverpool and Manchester in 1830, it did more than move passengers at the terrifying speed of 30 miles per hour. It shattered the human concept of space and time. Before the railway, every town in Britain kept its own time based on the local position of the sun. When it was noon in London, it might be 12:10 inches Bristol. But you cannot run a train network on local time. To avoid catastrophic collisions and maintain a schedule, the railway forced an entire nation and eventually the world to synchronize. For the first time in history, humanity marched to a single, standardized beat, railway time. The isolation of the rural world was over. Ideas, newspapers, and people began to spread at the speed of steam. But while Britain tried to guard its industrial secrets like crown jewels, passing laws to prevent engineers from emigrating, the fire could not be contained. The industrial virus began to leak. In the United States, skilled workers who had memorized the blueprints of British machines arrived on American shores. They didn't just copy, they innovated. They developed the American system of manufacturing interchangeable parts. Instead of a craftsman making a single clock or gun by hand, machines produced identical metal parts that could be assembled by anyone. This was the birth of mass production on a scale that would eventually allow the U.S. to overtake its teacher. In Germany, the revolution arrived through the steel-clad Ruhr Valley. Divided into dozens of small states, Germany was a fractured market until the railway acted as a political and economic glue. The demand for tracks created a hunger for steel that birthed giants like Krupp, turning a collection of kingdoms into a heavy industry powerhouse. Even in the East, the shockwaves were felt. Following the Meiji Restoration, Japan made a cold, calculated decision: industrialize or be colonized. They sent thousands of students abroad to steal the West's knowledge, transforming a feudal society of samurai into a modern industrial empire in just a few decades. By the mid-19th century, the first industrial revolution had matured, but a second, even more powerful wave was rising. The world was moving from the age of iron and steam to the age of steel, chemicals, and a mysterious new force, electricity. The Bessemer process allowed steel to be produced at a fraction of the previous cost, allowing cities to grow vertically into skyscrapers. Petroleum began to replace coal, and the internal combustion engine opened the door for the automotive age. The rhythm of life was no longer 12 hours of light. With the arrival of the electrical grid, the 24-hour city was born. The world was shrinking. A merchant in 1880 could track a shipment across the Atlantic with a precision that would have seemed like black magic to his grandfather. But as the planet became a single, interconnected machine, the friction between the industrial powers began to heat up. The race for resources, for coal, for iron, and for markets was no longer just about business. It was becoming a race for global survival. But what happens to a species that was designed to live in nature when it is suddenly plugged into a 24-hour electrical grid? As we look at the skyscrapers and the smartphones of today, we have to ask, did we master the machine, or did the machine master us? The final chapter of this revolution isn't found in history books, it's happening right now, in your pocket. Looking back, the Industrial Revolution was the most important event in human history since the invention of agriculture. It didn't just build our cities, it fundamentally redefined what it means to be human. It shifted us from a species that followed the slow, organic rhythm of the seasons to one that demands the world move at the speed of a machine. But this transition wasn't peaceful. It sparked a massive philosophical war that we are still fighting today. On one side, you had the dreamers of a new world. Thinkers like Adam Smith saw the division of labor and the rise of factories as a path to universal wealth. And in many ways, he was right. The Industrial Revolution brought sustained growth and lifted the material advancement of the Western world to heights that would have seemed godlike to a medieval king. For the first time in history, income and population began to undergo sustained exponential growth. But on the other side, there were those who looked at the smoke and felt a deep, existential terror. The romantics, the poets, the artists, the rebels recoiled at the dark satanic mills. They mourned the loss of nature, the destruction of the traditional rural life, and the crushing of the human spirit under the weight of iron gears. Then came Karl Marx, standing in the mud of Manchester, witnessing a system of exploitation that he believed would inevitably lead to a global explosion of the working class. He saw the factory not as a miracle of production, but as a cage where the worker became merely an appendage of the machine. Even the environment began to push back. The origins of our modern environmental crisis lie exactly here in the 19th century response to toxic smog and chemically poisoned rivers. We are the direct descendants of that first coal-fired spark. Every luxury we enjoy today, the cheap clothes in your closet, the food from halfway across the world in your fridge, the smartphone in your hand is a fruit of the tree planted in the 1700s. But the tree has long shadows. Remember the grandfather clock from the beginning of our story, the one that introduced standard time. Today we don't just follow the clock, we are consumed by it. We live in a world of boundless convenience and breathtaking speed, but we also carry the weight of the stress, the environmental cost, and the social divisions that progress left behind. The Industrial Revolution shifted the center of gravity from the east to the west, creating a massive economic divide that still shapes global politics today. It turned the quiet green fields into grid-patterned cities and replaced the silence of nature with the hum of the electrical grid. The legacy of the 18th century is embedded in our very DNA. We demand that the world move faster, produce more, and never sleep. We have mastered the machine, yes, but in the process, have we forgotten how to live without it? Revolutions arrive silently. By the time we notice they've changed everything, we can't even imagine life without them. We started this journey looking at steam engines and coal, but we ended up looking in a mirror. History isn't just about what happened, it's about why we are the way we are. The fire that was lit in a small British coal mine 250 years ago is still burning. It's burning in our engines, it's burning in our data centers, and it's burning in our relentless desire for more. The question is no longer how do we build a machine? The question for our generation is how do we survive the one we've built? Empire's Echoes is looking back at the past so we can understand the present. And together we keep history alive. See you in the next era.